Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. We haven't had a writer on in quite some time, so I want to take a moment to give an extra special intro to this guy. I want to welcome to the Whiskey Ring, star of stage and screen, still receiving residuals from Married with Children, former bartender at Brennan's in New Orleans, consummate New Jersey gentleman, storyteller extraordinaire, and Tommy Doer acolyte, Robin Robinson.
That's a good one. I like that one. I'll take the Tommy Doer acolyte accusation anytime. Yeah, absolutely.
He does come across in some ways as your spirit animal. So
Honest to God, when you start digging down into the guy and what he did and how he did it, and it was really about how he did it. The guy had panache. The guy had savoir-faire. I mean, he had like all of those things that would be an early 20th century French word for it.
I hear you. So I'm thrilled to have Robin on as a number one. It's been a long time since we've had a writer on the show, and also we are talking about his new book, "The History of Whiskey in 100 Bottles, Barrels, and More," that came out just this past fall, just a couple of months ago, as of recording. He has been making the rounds in person and on podcasts and shows, so I'm thrilled to welcome on here.
Well, thanks for having me, David. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about your career, how you got to here, and then we'll jump into some stuff from the book as well.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Fire away.
You've carved out a niche as a brand and marketing guru, a self-described Sherpa for big and small brands alike.
Yeah.
And how did that part of your career or this career emerge from impersonating a Scotsman and buying a Macallan 12?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, the impersonating the Scotsman goes back to my days as an actor, and it's a sort of a hoary, infamous old tale of me impersonating a Scotsman for a bunch of swells on Park Avenue back in, I think, I'm pretty sure it was 1986 or 1987. And I had gotten over on them the entire night. No, they did not know who I was. The only person who I knew who I was the host of the event, and it was a food pairing at their private club on Park Avenue, and the steward who was running the dining room were the only people who knew what the truth was. And at the end of the night, as we were toasting the 25-year-old Macallan, which back in those days was $90, I made up just the most horrendous story about how Macallan got started, and it's really just disgusting. And but it was the 15th century, so I mean, things happen. And that night, I got paid in cash, and the next morning I woke up and I suddenly had a taste for something that a week earlier I had never heard the word single malt Scotch whiskey before. And so that kind of starts me on like the whiskey journey, as opposed to being like, grab a bottle with a bunch of friends of something really cheap and get really screwed up and get really fucked up. This was about actually drinking and appreciating and understanding whiskey as if it were fine wine. And that was the intent back in those days with the early marketing companies like Shefflin and Somerset and Allied Domecq and those companies that were bringing these whiskeys over from Scotland for the first time in something other than a blend. Right. So if you remember, the classic malts would have been the first introduction of single malts to the United States, then followed by Glenlivet and a couple others. So so that was the beginning. But I had other things in life to do. This was a fun kind of like little thing, an interest. Had a living to make, had rent to pay. Now I had, then eventually I had a wife and then a child. And so we picked up and moved to California. That's where I thought my acting career was going. And Um, After only a few years out there, I had realized, actually, I went to a marketing program for actors. And at the end of the marketing program, I marketed myself out of the industry. I said, this actually isn't for me. Um, but at the time, what was rising was computers,
Mhm.
personal computers, business computers. And I was actually, I had gotten into those while I was still in New York. And I was very much into the technology of like these early PCs and Macs and Windows and DOS and things like that. Got into that to the point where I was eventually, I was an IT director and for an ad agency. And then eventually I got hired by my first software company. They moved me back to New York. And that's how we settled in New Jersey. And now I still had that thing about Scotch whiskeys, but now I had an expense account, and I had like what we were dealing with Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 level companies, and so the idea was go take these people out and things like that, very Mad Men, in
Mhm.
that, and and so, yeah, it just expanded, and I just started finding more and more, and then started a club in up here. Like, people were just tired of me, you know. And there's all the geeks and everybody today, but I'm telling you, in the early 2000s, I was the only guy at a party that would corner you and tell you all about single malt whiskey. Oh no, 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 you got to, because it's like barley and it's like it comes from Scotland, you know and then people were going, okay, like enough of this guy, and then I convinced or I bored enough of my friends around here to start a club. And we started a club, and I started a blog early on, called onemalt.com, and started blogging about our events, and then we were going out to shows and we were looking for bottles, and now it becomes a full-fledged thing. um, an old friend of mine who has known me since my acting days was at that time one of the most strategically important people in the liquor industry, in the distribution layer, in New York. And he had said to me one day before, he goes, you won't know more about whiskey than people who work for me. When are you going to get tired of selling technology and come to work for me? And I said, yeah, 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 yeah. Pour me another drink, because I don't know anything about the liquor industry. And then about a year later, we were at a party together, and he goes, "Look, I'm going to lay something down on the table for you. You tell me if you want to pick it up." And he described what he saw as what the brand ambassador really should be, as opposed to the way that it was being executed out into the marketplace. Whereas they were entertainment figures, they were cultural and educational figures. He said, but if you put a sales guy, a real sales guy, in that role, that guy could transform the entire industry. And that got me incredibly excited. So I put together a business plan for him, and he suggested that I come in and make this presentation to these very two large companies that were his largest suppliers at that time. One was called Diageo, and the other one was called Pernod Ricard. And I said, I don't really know much about those companies, but I can tell you that they're big companies, and I'm not very good in big companies. I'm not that kind of a player. I'm not good at politics, because I worked for all of these, startup Silicon Valley, mean and lean, and we had an elegant solution, and we were up against Microsoft and Oracle and SAP and everything, and it was um, that kind of a mentality and culture. So he says, "Well, you like Compass Box, don't you?" And I said, "Oh man, yeah. I mean, I met that guy, John Glazer, and that's the only blend that I pour at my whiskey club meetings." He goes, well, I got an idea. Well, the thing was, he actually had a piece of compass blocks. And so next thing you know, I'm the New York ambassador for compass blocks. And I was in that for a year until John Glazer and I had a conversation. And he goes, I know that you and Charlie talked about, why you came into this business. I'm interested to know if you still want to do that because I can't run the rest of the country. I need someone to do it because I have to run the company and I've got to make the whiskey. And I said, yeah. So I took over as the kind of sales manager. I'm essentially as a one-man band. I was a one-man band working 34 markets
Wow.
across the United States. And so I was a sales manager, brand manager, a brand ambassador, event planner. I mean, whatever the hell we needed, I was the guy that did it. And it was an incredible, phenomenal learning experience for me. I mean, unbelievable, like nothing I'd ever had, And I had kind of grown up through that whole the boom of Silicon Valley. So I learned an enormous amount there. But this was just like, because it was the liquor industry, and this is like, oh my God, are you kidding? This is straight the hell out of like the 1930s or the 40s right here, and they're still operating like that. And that's really when I looked around and said, wow, this is unsustainable. Everything that they're doing here is unsustainable. And guess what? The growth that we were going through at that point, I said, I think I just saw that at Silicon Valley. I saw that in the tech sector. I saw that in the bubble, the what I refer to as the irrational exuberance of the marketplace. And so after 7 years, it was time for Compass Box and me to part ways. And it was right at that time when we're really starting to see, this is right after the financial crisis of 2008. And we're really starting to see all of these brands pop up out of nowhere. And I was seeing a few. I met Gable Lorenzo and Ralph Lorenzo a couple of years before that. I met Lance Winters a couple of years before that. I met Todd Leopold. I met some of the people who had been around for a while, but now they're coming out of the woodwork. And I said, they need help. They don't know how to go to market. They've got more passion than they have knowledge and experience. Maybe that's where I'm supposed to be. So that's kind of how I started consulting and, doing what I call the brand Sherpa work. And I started teaching, when I was with Compass Box, I was teaching whiskey classes. And then, the books came out of the class. My first book, the Complete Whiskey Course, was somebody came to one of my classes, and he was an editor, and they were looking for an author to do a definitive whiskey reference book that had sort of a class structure to it. So the book, instead of 10 chapters, is actually 10 classes. And so that's where the first book came from. And then he and I collaborated for my second book again. So that's kind of like the whole thing. Yeah. Crazy.
It is. It's an unusual tale, and I can definitely empathize as the person who now people kind of gravitate away from, because I'm like, I got to talk about whiskey all the time at a party. So I know that feeling. I have to reel myself back.
I actually gravitate away from those people too.
Yeah. It took a while for me to realize, okay, reel it back in, David. Come on. Come here.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, there you go. Passion does that. No matter what it is that you're talking about, no matter, passion gets a hold of everything, and it realigns all of your understanding of actually how things are supposed to work in society. And kind of like, no, you want to hear about this. You need to hear about this.
Mhm.
So
Yep. It was just coming at me, and it would be. I'm just thinking like I consider myself as like a real introvert, all the way on the end of one spectrum on that,
okay.
and it's one of the few things in a group of people that will
Well,
get me
there you
going.
go. It's the thing that lights you up, man. Yeah, absolutely. And
Exactly.
that's what's actually that's what's been wonderful about it, because you're not alone, as you know. I mean, there's a whole. I mean, this is. I've written that there are more words written about whiskey than any other subject except love and sex. That's the only other two other subjects that have more words written about them. There was everybody had a blog. There were books out like crazy.
Mhm.
And then when social media took over, then it was like wow, you know. So yeah,
Yeah.
I understand it, and I think it was great. It was terrific. It was fun. I mean, and it still is fun. Um, being around that energy, nothing wrong with that, you know. And it's
Yeah.
not really booze based, it's really about booze, you
Mhm.
know. I think we all tend to stay away from people who's like, okay, dude, that's like, go home. But you don't see much of them anymore.
No. So you have an editor who comes to you to complete this. Really, it's a trilogy or a three set, however you want to call it, of the complete blank course. We've got Kevin's Raleigh with the complete wine course, um, from Windows on the World, so late 90s. And then we've got the complete beer course, which I have the book, but I do not have the author's name in front of me, so I
Yeah,
apologize
it's
to him.
Joshua Bernstein. Yeah,
Joshua Bernstein, thank you.
yeah,
So you complete the original trilogy,
yeah,
shall we
yeah.
call it?
This was the trifecta. And it was the same publisher.
Oh,
That's what they had in mind. We've got wine, we got beer. Now we need to put whiskey together, and yeah, it's complete.
absolutely. And if you're going through a bookstore and you're new to the industry, as all of us were at some point, and you want to know, get the basics, get a little more than the basics, your complete whiskey course is usually one of the two or three books that I point to. It's you guys,
Oh, thank you.
Lou Bryson's Tasting Whiskey,
Oh, sure.
and then I might throw in one more like historical one just to give a basic history of
Yeah.
some of the things. But in terms of understanding whiskey and appreciating it, those are my starting points. So I that's usually where I recommend people to start as well.
Dave Broom, Michael Jackson, you
Yeah,
know, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
right.
And you, with people new to the industry, you always got to be like, not that Michael Jackson, different Michael Jackson,
Yeah, the one without the
uh,
glove.
the one without the glove. Yes. Um, so, and
Can
of
you
course,
believe it? That conversation came up in person just 2 or 3 days ago. And I think I or somebody else went on about Michael Jackson for 4 minutes until someone said, not everybody knows who Michael Jackson is. And I'm going, okay, let's back it up. Right. So,
sure, absolutely. Uh, no, he one of the real I hate using this term, but real OGs of whiskey writing,
oh,
really
yeah.
modern whiskey writing, and he's I think in my top three of whiskey people that I won't get to interview because they passed or
Yeah.
one of the reasons, but he was ahead of his time and really set the foundation. So
Yeah, he did.
it,
And he left
because
left a legacy.
he did, and so some of that legacy comes through for your first book, and then now we are in not only your new book, we're both in this center of whiskey writers and spirits writers, where we're convening either at Travel Bar, at the Archer, at this and that place around the city and around New Jersey. And I would think it just as a writer, it must be, I don't know if inspiring is the right word. I'm curious what your thought is, but invigorating to constantly be around people who are writing about the same general topics as you are, but from different points of view and different angles. So you have to work harder to find that niche. Would that be accurate?
Oh, well, yeah. Although interesting, I don't really consider myself a writer. I consider myself as a salesman who can write. And for
Ooh.
me, there's a difference. I am always, forever focused on the marketplace. So everything I do has a focus on the marketplace. And yeah, and that includes other people. So I'm the one that actually has my ear on the ground. And interesting enough, it was actually Dave Broom who reminded me of that when when I got the contract for the first book, and I'm going, how do I approach this? There's Chuck Cowdery, there's like Dave Broom, there's Lou Bryson, there's like Michael Jackson, there was all these writers. I'm going, what do I have to offer here? I mean, that's going to be different.
Mhm.
And Dave said, but Robin, you're the only one of us that sold something, that sold whiskey. And it's like, oh, wow. Yeah, that like rang like a bell in my head, you know.
Mhm.
And in that book, I think I may be the only author that actually listed other authors in their book. And no
I
one
don't have
else
to go
has
back.
done
I,
that.
I believe that. I
Oh
would
no,
believe that.
I gave shout outs to everybody who had been an influence, everybody from Fred Minnick to Lou to Chuck to at that time uh, what's his name um, in London with the whiskey Bible.
Oh, Murray.
Jim Murray, yeah, Jim
Yeah.
Murray, and a whole bunch of people, and Mark Gillespie on Whiskey Cast. I mean, I
Mhm.
gave everybody a shout out in that book because they deserved it, because people should know that, So yeah, so I'm competitive in one way as a sales guy, but on the other hand, I certainly acknowledge, the people who are influential to me and actually who could help other people on their journey. I'm not the singular voice out there, for God's sake. So yeah,
Oh, understood.
yeah.
So with that, we'll move into the new book that we've got in front of us, History of Whiskey, 100 Bottles, Barrels, and More. And going to your point about being a salesperson who can write, this is you've described it as a collection of 100 short stories rather than a history or a class in the mold of your previous book.
Right.
When the publisher gave you the impetus for this, the 1 year, 50,000 words, go,
Yeah.
um, this would be new to you. And how did you go about reimagining your process to accomplish what you had to accomplish?
Well, right here in my office, I actually have a big foam core board that I have up there. It's white, and on it, I've got 120 um, uh, colored tabs,
Mhm.
and each one of them has an object on it. And then I started arranging them by country or by area of the world. And so I started putting together as that. Um, if it's 100 objects, and I have the book, for example, The History of the World in Six Glasses, The History of the World in 100 Objects. So I get the format. I understand, how the format works, and I enjoy that. And I like writing in short form. Um, I've gotten better at it since my first book, which was completely overwritten, and I spent 8 months editing it because I didn't know any better. Um, and so, yeah, this kind of gave me a focus. This allowed me to get more, yeah, more detailed. And so I started finding. I went through all of the research notes that I had left over from my first book, and then all the research notes that I do from all of my classes and all this. I mean, so I've got like 15 years of research notes. It got stored away somewhere, in something,
Mhm.
and then all of the experiences that I had prior to that, and so, yeah, I said, okay, now it's just like, now we're going to put it in object form. What would be the objects? What would be the bottles that I know that are going to be a portal into some aspect? And then, of course, as we know, whiskey only goes back 400 or 500 years. So now it's actually before that. And how did that start? So that's why the very, very first object in the book is a pot. because that was the first time that mankind, you know, anthropologically combined disparate ingredients to get something new.
Mhm.
You know, a stew, a soup, you know, a mash of this and of that, and you put a whole bunch of, you know, you mash them all together, and then you add liquid, and then you heat it either by the sun or by a fire, and next thing you know, it turns into something completely different. Well, there you go. There's the beginning right there. And you know, and that's as what's known as the cucurbit, the essentially the bottom pot of a pot still.
Mhm.
And then I that was the perfect, you know, way to start it. Now let me build from there. Now, how did we get the top pot? Right, that
Mhm.
alembic. You know, where did that come from? You know, what was the point of that? You know, and then it asks the question, well, what's distillation? You know, there are many
Mhm.
different forms of distillation. One of the ones I mentioned in the book is about Aristotle. You know, there was a hoary old story, and then I kind of dug into it and I found some old history books that actually, and again, you know, in the introduction of the book, I said, look, a lot of the stuff you can't, it may not, who knows? But if I can find three independent viewpoints that point in that direction, that's probably where the truth of this story is at. And
Mhm.
last thing I want to do is get bogged down in facts. You know, facts are there just to ground the story. And the whole thing is that the story has got to be entertaining. It's got to get from, you know, Aristotle once said that, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's a format. As an
Mhm.
actor, I lived by that format. So, so yeah, so that was pretty much how it all kind of like, started to come together. And then, I've got like 1,000 bottles here in my house, and so I can go down, I can go through uh, um, um, my racks, and say, oh, okay, here's something here, right? And then, yeah, and then that leads to this over here, that, and then another tab goes up on that board,
Mhm.
and then I'm moving tabs around, to kind of, now it's actually starting to take shape. And then with my editor at the time, then we said, okay, well, then we need to put this in some sort of a chronological order so that people, if the whole idea was to read it independently, 100 short stories, but
Mhm.
let's put them in some sort of an order. So if you did want to make a time frame connection, there was the Baroque period, and then there was, prehistory and things like that. You could do that. So that's kind of like how that came.
For sure. And as I was starting the book, I looked at this. I was thinking about the bread and beer theory in anthropology, and a
Oh
couple of years
yeah,
ago,
which came first? Yeah.
exactly. A couple of years ago, I had on Edward Slingerland, author of Drunk, to talk about kind of the earliest earliest beer get-togethers at Göbekli Tepe and places like that. And this idea that people got drunk and people tested alcohol, and if everyone woke up in the morning and nobody had killed each other, cool, we're
Good.
friends, we're good. Uh, so,
Well, what's interesting is that, so that idea is what carries on into Ireland, especially.
mhm.
And it's the wonderful story of the antipathy between Peter Rowe, who was one of the first distillers in Dublin in the
Mhm.
18th century, and Arthur Guinness. And at that time, beer was considered healthful. It was considered, it was a cousin to bread.
Mhm.
And so it had a health benefit to it that everybody in the 18th century believed, and well into the 19th century too.
Mhm.
Yet whiskey was poison, and so Guinness and Roe, and then came Jameson, and then came a whole bunch of people, and then eventually Power showed up, and then you had like you had the Golden Triangle there in Dublin. but all during that time, Guinness just despised all that and thought it was poison because it wasn't beer. And the
Mhm.
irony, of course, is that when the Roe distillery closed down, that is currently the Guinness operation right now. Guinness took it over, so he kind of got his, he kind of got his revenge there. But yeah,
Yeah,
the
and
bread thing, the all of that, is very much a part of how this all kind of like follows an evolutionary trail.
and I want to bring up something you said at the. So I got to know this book at a travel bar launch event,
Yeah,
and one of the quotes that you said that stuck with me is, "We as a whiskey community have lost the story and gotten stuck
yeah,
in the details."
yeah.
Clearly, I know you're someone who does enjoy both. You can get into the nitty gritty and you can get on the story and enjoy both sides, and I do both as well. I might lean more into the details. I like to know the fermentation times and all those kinds of really nerdy details. Um, but in saying that we've lost the story and gotten stuck in the details, do you think there is a place where they both coexist equitably, or do we have
Oh,
to shift
well,
our focus back?
absolutely. Oh, no, no. I mean, essentially, that's my book. Actually, both of my books were written for that ear. I'm writing for that ear, and yet I'm substantiating it with real information, with real facts. Facts don't have to be boring. It's only when facts become the story is when the entire thing goes to hell.
Mhm.
When it really is only about the fermentation time, then I literally walk out the door. I don't have anything to say to these people. You know, if you're going to obsess about all of the details about warehouse age, I know that most of that is bullshit.
Mhm.
But if it caught you and now you're on like some kind of crazy, ADHD obsession about it, I had this conversation last night at a bar, about old Overhold, you know,
Mhm.
and you know, when we lose the story, then we fail to bring more people. The whole idea is to get everybody swimming in the pool. And what happens with facts is facts create gatekeepers, and gatekeepers prevent people from coming into the pool. Now, one of the things I learned from Compass Box is that, again, I worked 34 markets in the United States. I worked with big, massive, distribution companies and one-man bands in Wisconsin. You know,
Mhm.
I've tasted 10,000 people, out in the wild, from bartenders to consumers to salespeople to everybody, right? That tasted them on a whiskey. When I first started, I was literally spelling the word artisanal for people because we were the first company to have the artisanal story, and then Dunkin' Donuts came out with an artisanal donut. But so during all that time, during all that time, you know what the number one feedback I got during all those years was the words in an apology form, I'm
Mhm.
not an expert. Every one of these people would say, I'm not, I don't know anything about this. I'm not an expert. And right there, that clued me into something. Then about 10 years ago, I sat down with Shinji Fukuyu. Now, Shinji Fukuyu is the chief blender at Suntory, and he was on a U.S. tour right after they had made the acquisition of Beam.
Mhm.
And he was coming into New York, and he had asked a mutual friend. Um, a, a, she was a early podcaster back then. If he could sit down with somebody and talk about whiskey, somebody who was knowledgeable but wasn't affiliated with a brand, and she goes, "Oh, I've got just a guy." And we all got together. It was four of us got together at Angel Share Cocktail Bar, when it
Mhm.
was open, and I had the most revealing evening with Shinji-san. And it was because he said this to me. He goes, I've traveled the entire United States, and he's very Western oriented. He worked with Scotch whiskey, for many years. Um, on this tour, Americans are very, very smart people, and they really love the details. And I've been interviewed by Bloomberg and by all of the bloggers and New York Times and everybody like that, Wall Street Journal. And everyone was asking me about temperatures and fermentation times, and is it 2 row or 6 row, and like all of these questions. Not one person asked me about flavor. And now this is a man whose job is to create flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sincerely puzzled. It wasn't a condemnation or a criticism. He was actually sincerely puzzled about that. And what I took away from that is that Americans do not have a vocabulary for flavor, because that's not how we see things that we ingest. We eat, or we ate in previous generations, to live. Food was fuel. Food was something that you ate, and then you went out and you got something done.
Mm-hmm.
Every kid my age was always smacked at the table, shut up and eat and go out and play, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that time, when I was growing up, I never saw fresh vegetables. You know, I never saw. Asparagus came in a glutinous mass inside of a tin can. Um, you know, a large green happy giant was overseeing all of my frozen vegetables.
I mentioned the one other quote that stuck with me from the travel bar event. I want to say the second one, which was, it's repeated in the book, but it's worth repeating here, that the tax man has changed and shaped whiskey more than any producer, distiller, or scientist.
Yeah, right.
So let's explore that a little bit, because I
Yeah.
feel it's true, but let's explore that.
So the whole idea of taxing, right, is it actually, well, there's no one whole idea of taxes. Taxes are meant since antiquity of a way of what?
Raise money,
Exuding power.
and yeah.
You go back to biblical times, right? I mean, and before, there was always someone wants something from someone else, and yeah, we're going to raise money, but it's typically as an exhibition of power as well. And then, of course, over the centuries, it got more and more refined. There was the Caesar tax, right?
Mhm.
And essentially that's pretty much like the civilization that really kind of started. That was the Pax Romana. you
Mhm.
know um but it was a way to actually, yeah, bring in revenue, right? And then, but it was a way to exude power onto a populace as well. And so that idea of getting money from people just to live, just to be part of this, well, then obviously you have to give them something back in return, right? And so what did Rome do? Rome gave you roads, and Rome gave you water, and so that was the trade-off, right? And so civilizations, ever since then, uh, have refined that idea. I'm going to take some money from you, and conceivably, I'm going to give you back something that will be of benefit to you. Doesn't
Those
always
who
work.
didn't, yeah, those who didn't, those nobles didn't usually last long.
Well, there you go. I mean, essentially, when you're talking about tax revolts, you're talking about tax revolts, right? And that is not a new idea in history as well. So when you start moving with that through the British Isles, now the British Isles was really interesting, because what was the kings of England trying to do with their subjects? And that last word is the key
Mhm.
word to the question,
Right.
right? That they were trying to, control them, and for centuries, And they were trying to control their outer regions, and that one region ended up being what we call Scotland, and another region ended up becoming what we know as Ireland. And and so the way to actually keep them in control, and also not and also to suppress any type of revenue generation that they would be able to do outside of the king's coffers.
Mhm.
And if you notice, one of the stories inside of the book is about one of the objects is a coffer,
Mhm.
keeping the king's coffers, and it doesn't matter. Now, malt taxes go all the way back to Germany, and we're talking in like the 13th century and 14th century.
Mhm.
And that whole idea was brought forward. Now, why malt? Well, because beer was an essential part of civilization and an essential part of keeping people alive, especially when we realized that it did have a healthful effect, and we couldn't drink the water because that was killing us.
Right.
So a malt tax was very, very specific, and that all the brewers were kind of used to that. And part of your job, if you were in a highland area or some kind of remote area, your job is to avoid the tax. That's why. That's because you're not getting any of the quote unquote services that the king said he's going to provide way the hell out here in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So you have this dynamic tension that goes on for centuries, over the idea of, it could be wheat, it could be malt, it could be anything, and also that these were all crofter scenarios up there, right? So crofter is essentially a tenant farmer, and in the manner of all royal realms, those who are closest to you are going to get these big tracts of land, and in order for you to actually produce a tax for the king, then you have to get people on that land, and then they will actually pay you as the landlord, and through what they make. And so all the way down, you can see how that. So when distilling came about, there was already a taxes on malt. That was, and then taxes on wheat. It would be whatever they felt like taxing you on, they tax you on, right? But when the whole idea of distilling came around, they realized that that they needed malt. Malt was really what was going to be at the basis of this,
Mhm.
and so different types of malt taxes were posed as well. Now, that came up to the whole idea is like, can we get to those people? And there's um, one story in there about smugglers. To smuggle was a rite of passage in the British Isles.
Mhm.
That was a rite of if the Scots and the Irish considered um, um, uh, distilling as sort of a birthright, then smuggling was a rite of passage. So they kind of like went hand in hand.
Sure.
Um, and so you have over and over and over, you see that the ruling authority is keeping track of what it is that you're doing so that they can get the requisite tax. And your job is to make sure that you don't pass the tax, right? So
Mhm.
if they're going to pass a tax on, let's say, the size of the still, right, that it
Mhm.
has to be a certain size, well, then you're going to get a smaller still, right?
Right.
If they're going to pass a tax on the amount of malt, then you're going to change the amount of malt. And when you go back and you start looking at, in the lowland areas, right, which were close to the civilization of Edinburgh and Glasgow, because they were port cities,
Mhm.
and they were closer to England, right, and much easier for gaugers to be involved in the civilization and in society right there. Those lowland distillers like the Haigs and the Steens, the ones who essentially created commercial distilling in the British Isles,
Mhm.
they paid the tax, right? But they put less and less malt in there because it was a malt tax. So that means they would throw all kinds of shit in there. And it was this terrible stuff that they were pumping out of those stills, right? However, it didn't matter because not all of it was going to whiskey. Most of it was being actually just portaged over to northern England, where they had deals with rectifiers there, and that would eventually get rectified into gin because they knew that England actually had an appetite for gin, and of course, we all know about Gin Lane and the gin epidemic right there. So, and why was that? Because it was cheap, right? And we were starting to industrialize. And as we start to industrialize, we're moving more people off of farms and into closed, crowded corners, and which is a Dickensian nightmare. And people are going to drink. Up in the Highlands, it's a completely different area. Over in Ireland, it's a completely different thing. These are not industrialized areas right now. They were kind of given the art of distillation from the monks that came out of the monasteries after Henry VIII abolished the church. And they became itinerant farmers out there. And they knew that inside, like in London, in Dublin, for example, in those areas that were called liberties, the liberties were these individual economic zones that were granted by the king and then blessed by the Pope at that time. They were these individual zones, and that's where you really see the height of all of these magical arts that have been passed down through the generations, all through the medieval days. And that's where beekeeping and animal husbandry and plant grafting and all of these, and then of course brewing and distilling. They go out into the after the king closes, after King Henry VIII closes them all down. They go out. They actually have to make a living now. They're itinerant distillers, and then here come the taxes, right? Here come the taxes on malt in Ireland. So in Scotland, they actually had a revolt, and that was the big malt riots of 17. I can't remember the dates for the malt riots, and they actually got the taxes, the tax structure changed. In Ireland, they said, "Screw that! We're just not going to pay any attention to it, and we're just not going to put any malt in the poochin." And so they started putting on, green barley, and they did that on both sides, but they started putting green barley. The thing was, um, they got a connection to that. They liked that taste,
Mhm.
right? And so the green barley, the unmalted barley, became eventually what we know now as Irish pot still style whiskey. Um, and so when you move into, and so in both cases, the taxes are now showing up as a big part of the king's coffers. And a lot of people are really making a lot of stuff out there, right?
Mhm.
And so Bushmills, for example, Bushmills, was part of was King James's um, animal husbandry approach to making a better English subject, and subjugating the Gaels, the Gaelic population of Ireland. And he grants, he takes a million acres up in what we now know as Northern Ireland, and he grants these out to different of his lords, and says, "Okay, here, this is yours. This is yours. You just gotta, obviously, you gotta pay me back on this as well. But here's the idea. I want you to take all these numbnuts and this, all of these, people in Scotland that are living like in a Bronze Age, mentality here. All the people off the streets of London, and I'm going to ship them up there, and it's beautiful, verdant, green land up there. They can make a living. They're going to work for you. You're going to be the landlord. And I'm going to give you the right to do a lot of things. And here is, for example, a charter to actually distill. The first guy that actually came, that got the land in Coleraine, his whole life was a mess. He never ended up distilling on him. Wasn't for 150 years later that Bushmills actually started distilling. So their 1600s date on the label is kind of a misnomer.
Right. Right.
However, what they did do was they always paid the king's malt tax. And that's why throughout history, Bushmills has always been consistently 100% malted barley for them. Then you kind of move over, and then so in Scotland, all of this, what are we going to do with these crazy Highlanders up there? And George, I can't remember his name now. George Grant, who owned this one distillery that eventually became known as Glenlivet. His whiskey was favored by the king through his landlord, and what they were doing was they were actually debating something that they had seen their former American colonies in the United States undertake when Alexander Hamilton put together the idea and sold to Congress the idea of an excise tax on the rye distillers in Western Pennsylvania. And they said, oh, well, the whole idea of taxing that is that actually they're doing that in order to pay for the revolution that they fought, to get rid of us. Why don't we enact? And it took them about 30 years for them to kind of work that idea through the halls of Parliament until eventually you saw in 1823, which was the excise tax was formed. Let's legitimize their business. Let's put a reasonable tax burden on their output, just like any other craft person. If you're making leather goods, if you're making brooms, I'm going to tax you on it. And let's let them grow a legitimate business. And that's where you see the flowering of whiskey in Scotland from that point. You go over to the United States and you have, into North America, and you have not only in the United States, but you have in Canada, which was the beginning of industrialization of whiskey over there. And you had like the big five. You had Seagram, you had Gooderham and Warts, you had Hiram Walker, you had Henry Corby, and you had J.P. Weiser. And these guys are literally paying the taxes for all of the Canadian citizens. All of the taxes that the Canadian regime needed was coming from whiskey. And the same thing was happening in the United States. Whiskey was paying all the taxes. That was the whole idea of actually how to the whiskey ring, and then the whiskey trust was all about actually consolidating, and actually it was a tax dodge. So all throughout everything, and when you look at in the United States, the 1897 Bottled and Bond Act, well, yeah, part of that was all about, well, how do we guarantee this? But actually, how do we guarantee this so that we can tax this? I mean, yeah, it's going to be 4 years in a federally locked warehouse with 2 locks, 1 key, one for the tax man, one for the distillery manager. No one's getting in there unless both of them. Then the whole idea of the spirit safe in Scotland, right, was how do I tax the output before the distiller can get it out of there. I don't know if you remember, there was a Scotch whiskey that was around for a while called Sheep Dip.
Yep.
Remember that? Well, the whole idea of Sheep Dip was a way that actually the distillers used to avoid the taxes, and so yeah, so taxing is part of it. And in each case, what is the distiller going to do? Well, I can either pay the tax, but no one likes taxes. It's the most hated word in every language. So how do I lessen my ability to pay a tax, or how do I avoid the tax altogether? I'm going to make a smaller still. I'm going to put the still out here. I'm going to do this in transport. I'm going to actually add this instead of this. I'm going to make all of these differentiations so I can get away from that tax. And when you see that, then you start seeing the progress of how the flavor of whiskey starts to evolve over time. Because if someone's got their hand in your back pocket, you're going to do everything you can to get that out of there, either by hook or by crook or a combination of both. And so that's why, I make the the conjecture that the tax man had more to do with the flavor of what's in the glass, especially in the Western world. Now, this doesn't really apply as much to Japan, who was the fifth largest whiskey kingdom, so to speak.
Mhm.
But this is in the Western world that kind of came out of that kingly tax tradition, and how to develop it. So, yeah, so I definitely make that claim that what you're tasting is a result of the taxman, indirectly.
Absolutely. It seemed that the first interaction was the taxman being reactive. And then after that, it's been kind of, I would say, a balance, but more reacting to the taxman since
Yeah,
then. Yeah,
yeah,
Excise Acts 1823. See a lot of distilleries in Scotland with an 1824 start date, if you will, but it's really a
yeah,
legitimization date, as you said.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we're
eight,
we're 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 putting it in bond, we're
right,
putting it in
exactly,
bondage. Yeah, right.
exactly. Uh, so going through the book, there's a multitude of media through which the history of whiskey changed. It's, as the title implies, it's not just bottles or barrels. It's or single products, even. It's changes to equipment, as we were just talking about, changes to tax structure, changes in drinking culture, like moving from nutrition to medicine to recreation, and events like prohibition. um, Before we go into a couple more of those, as I read through the book, careful not to look at the table of contents to kind of spoil the ending, if you will, I kept thinking, what items, events, people were left on the cutting room floor that really like made it to the last round, and then you were just like, I can't include these for either space or some other reason.
Oh, well, I don't know. I literally would have to go look at my notes to see what it was. Well, one of the things that guided me on this was the fact that when I wrote my first book, The Complete Whiskey Course, I literally had no idea how to write a book. I was given a contract, I was given a specific word count that I had to hit,
Mhm.
and we were going to do it in a classroom form like I was teaching for many years down in New York City. And we had agreed on, okay, these will be the 10 classes, the first class, second class. And then I went through all kinds of panic attacks that I couldn't do it. And I had an agent at the time, and she had to talk me down off the cliff. And then my editor had to talk me down off the cliff. And at one point, he goes, "Just write the damn thing," And I said, "Well, okay," So I started writing it, and I ended up handing in a manuscript of 170,000 words. They gave me 40,000 for the book. I handed in 170,000. By that time, that editor had left and another editor had come in. And I said, well, he goes, "Do you realize how much editing this is going to be to get this done?" I said, well, quote unquote, you're the editor. That's your job. You know who Kevin Israeli is, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Kevin Israeli is the great, the wine author, but Kevin, ran the Windows on the World uh, wine cellar, which at that time was the biggest in the world, and has written the complete wine course, of which the complete whiskey course was sort of like, the companion piece. And I called him up randomly one day, and I said, how did you do this? And he goes, "Look, I'm not a writer, right? So I just, and the editor comes in and they have a blank screen in front of them every morning. Your job is to fill that up." I said, "Well, okay, great." So I took kind of Kevin's, advice to fill up their screen. And he goes, editor advice says, "How much editing this is going to take?" I said, "Well, Kevin's really and he goes, "No, if you remember in your contract, you specifically stated that you wanted to have the last voice. That means you're going to do the edit." So he took a hand grenade and essentially threw it in the middle of that manuscript. I spent the next 7 months reassembling it and then reducing it down to the form that we finally got it in. So I had that in the back of my mind. And since then, I started writing articles for online blog pieces and for some periodicals like Whiskey Advocate. And so I'm now getting my crazy, Jack Kerouac, just keep writing it type of a thing out of my head. And I'm learning how to do something that the writers refer to as killing your darlings, which is, you write the most beautiful sentence in the world and you're so in love with it, but then you realize it doesn't work here. So you got to throw it out. So with this, I had 50,000 words and I said, okay, well, I'm doing 100 stories. 50,000 words, that's pretty easy. That's 500 words per story. I've got to keep this down to 500 words. So as I was going through my notes, as I was collecting, um, uh, artifacts, and I was collecting information, I always had that in mind. I think I was performing like a real writer. I was editing as I was writing. So, I don't know if you can see this here. I'm going to see if I can turn my camera to this, and they're not going to be able to see it. No, you can't see that. So I have right up here on my wall. I put a big sheet of foam core up there, and I got a whole bunch of tabs that you use for marking places in, and on each one of these, I wrote down the thing, the one of the 100 things that I was going to write about. And I stuck them up there according to like country.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the big five are represented up there. But then I write a lot about things that happened in antiquity. So I started writing, headings up there called the world, and then this was antiquity. This was Middle Ages, and so up here I still have it up there. Are about 105 um, different one of these tabs up there that actually has the name of the thing that I would, and so that was my guiding principle right there, was to kind of stick to that, and throughout for example, in America, there's already, I even make fun of the fact that there's so many words written about Pappy Van Winkle. I don't need to write another word about Pappy Van Winkle. But if I'm going to be honest you know, about the history of whiskey, then you have to include, Pappy Van Winkle and Stitzelweller. So I did, you know, um, alluding to the fact that they've got their own book,
Mm-hmm.
so, what
Multiples,
else
yeah.
needs to be said, you
Yeah.
know? Um, so it's just kind of things like that. I think I actually I approached it much more professionally than I did before, so that the editing was really all about buffing and shining, as opposed to like getting it down to a format that was going to be usable for the book. Um, so yeah, so it's kind of like a difficult process to talk to recall.
I don't know. Understood. And there are, as we got earlier in the interview, there are a number of course, people, specific people called out. We spoke obviously about Tommy Dewar earlier on as a spirit animal kind of thing, but there was only one person in the book that got this written about them, and this could be an author's choice. So tell me if it is. But I wanted to pull it out, which was, in some ways, we can mark whiskey's history as before Swan and after Swan.
Oh my God.
And look, I he's my number one whiskey person. I'll never get to interview who I really want to,
Yeah, I know.
obviously because he's passed. But I noted that as I was reading it, because I'm thinking there are so many people pulled out in this book as seminal singular figures who changed whiskey in one way or another.
Right.
But he's the only one that got that kind of epithet to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no. I did have the great honor and pleasure of meeting him and actually sipping some whiskey with him. That was literally the first Cavalon
Mm.
that was introduced, and I was introduced to him by John Glazer. I was working with Compass Box at the time. John was particularly influenced by Swan. because of Swan's impact on wood. All of the stuff that had been known anecdotally about the interaction between wood and whiskey for hundreds of years, Swan, as a consultant, as a biochemist, and as a consultant for the Scotch whiskey industry, um, Swan had actually now codified and had put that all of that down on a molecular level in these incredibly detailed white papers that I actually had access to. And I'm not a scientist, but I've played one on TV. And so I tried making my way through them as much as I could. But this was back, 15 years ago. Um, his impact on compass box was immense because that was the whole idea of the toasted French oak that started out as spice tree and eventually became oak cross and eventually became essentially the core DNA of all compass box whiskeys is a blend of two or three malts that are aged in French oak. That's essentially the compass box DNA methodology. So I got introduced to Jim Swan, or Dr. Swan, I should call him Dr. Swan, through that. And when I got to meet him, we got to talk for a very short amount of time. But yeah, and then you start looking at the influence that he had. So he and Dave Pickerel, for example, Dave Pickerel, who was the master distiller here at Maker's Mark, and Dave Pickerel was the Johnny Appleseed of American craft whiskey. Jim Swan was the Johnny Appleseed of world whiskey. Everybody went out there and reached out to Jim Swan, and can you help us with this? And that's essentially what he did. He was a consultant to the world, practically everybody, and also inside the United States too. He was consulted many times with distilleries in the United States. So yeah, I think no one has had the impact worldwide. And the example that I show in the book about Cavallon, about he deconstructed the whole history of whiskey, not starting from I've got some grain, I'm going to make it into a beer. I've got some beer, I'm going to distill into whiskey. I've got some whiskey, I got to put it in something. I'm going to put in this barrel in this type of a warehouse, and then boom. No, he started out with what is the ambient temperature of Taiwan, and you have to actually, that is going to be your controlling factor here. So now we're going to construct a warehouse and then a racking system, and then we're going to go backwards, your distilling protocol, and then your fermentation, that means, and your yeast, and then your mashing process. Wow. Mm-hmm. And just brilliant. And we lost him 2017. He passed away. And I think his last project that he was working on was Lindores Abbey in Scotland, which again, historically, that's the marker where Scots like to look at and say, okay, this is kind of like where we saw it all written down for the first time. But yeah, Jim Swan, wow, man, what an incredible impact that guy's had on one person. Yeah, before Swan and after Swan. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, it's again, there's so many people there that you can make an argument of being impactful or important for one country, one area, even. If we get to it, I have a question, for example, about the importance of Pernod Ricard as a company in saving Canadian and Irish whiskey. Yeah. But with Dr. Swan, I agree with you. You look at the number of countries that he was in, the number of different environments: Taiwan, Israel, Wales, number here in the U.S.,
just India, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, Germany, England. Yeah.
It's amazing. I agree. Really one of the greats, and I definitely I wish on my list that I had gotten a chance to meet him, share a dram, but
we lost a giant, and both of those men, both Pickerel.
Yeah, we lost Dave the next year.
Yeah, we lost them both. Yeah, in a very short amount of time. Yeah, it was a very sad time for distilling.
Yeah. So it'll seem like a somewhat of a non sequitur after that, but it does kind of connect, which is you also had to make the choice as you were editing to consider which brands to highlight. Some of
Yeah.
them easy, well, in my mind, easy.
Yeah, sure.
you know, uh, but there are a couple that I want to pull out that for me, it raised the question of you're highlighting the history of whiskey through, in this case, a couple of brands and bottles.
Mhm.
Um, and there's kind of a tenuous balance that you have to strike between the importance of this barrel bottle
Oh yeah.
and the access of it.
Yeah.
For example, Glenlivet 1962 single malts, Napogue 1951 Ichiro Card Series. These
Yeah.
are all mentioned and agree as seminally important whiskeys. They're also hard, if not impossible, to access in many cases.
Yeah,
um,
sure. Yeah.
so I I guess in your mind as you're writing, then how do you go about conveying the importance of something that in theory is tangible, but in practice few if any people will have the chance to try in a way that could make them appreciate it even more.
Well, that was actually irrelevant to me
Hmm.
because that wasn't what this book was all about. You know, um, you know, that's yeah. That's now if I was writing, volume two of the complete whiskey course, that would have been a different thing. And when you look at the difference between my book and every other book that's out there on the marketplace, is that they, there's a couple out there now that have cocktail recipes and that was not, if I would have used that as a criteria, this book never would have gotten done.
Hmm.
You know, that the availability of that particular thing was absolutely irrelevant. What it meant was the most important thing to me. What it meant to the history of whiskey. Did it track somewhere in that arc? You know, and whether or not you could taste it, hey, that's fine. If you've never had the 1951 Napogue, I have, then this is something for your imagination. You know, um, if you've never had this whiskey or that whiskey, that to me that didn't matter. That played literally no uh, because that's not what this book was. This book was not a current appreciation. That will be volume two or an updated version of my first book.
Hmm.
If you read my first book, it was all about this is what's on the marketplace right now. These are the people who are making it. This is how they're doing it. Yada yada. Great. That was a compendium of where we were with whiskey at that particular. This had nothing to do with it. You know,
Totally fair. I mean,
you know.
that reminds me kind of there are books out there like the 100 whiskeys you have to taste before you die or
Yeah, that's
things like that.
fine. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that's not what you were writing about.
No, fuck no. Oh, Jesus, no. Oh my God,
Yeah.
no. I mean, that was the complete opposite of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, complete opposite of that. And look, I am very much in favor of writers being shills for the business, and I'm as much a shill as anybody else. I don't mind being a shill, if especially, I'm a shill for a lot of things. I'm a shill for I don't have one up here, but I'm a shill for like the neat glass. You know,
Mhm.
um, I think the neat glass is literally the best nosing and performance glass on the market. I don't get a penny for that, and I don't care to get a penny for it. You know, um, because that's what I believe. So this is my recommendation. So the bottles that I get behind, sometimes I have a commercial arrangement with different um, I still am a consultant in the industry, so I'm still vested in the sales of specific things. But when I kind of segment myself as a writer and or influencer, if and I put that in quotes,
Mhm.
um,
I know you don't
then
like the
hey,
term, so
oh, I hate the term, yeah.
yeah.
But I'm a shill, and I'm proud of it. I don't mind being that. This whiskey, especially now, the whiskey industry needs as many shills as possible. So, yeah, I don't have a problem. So yeah, so the selection of things to me was, does it fit in the historical narrative of the arc? And will this illuminate will it illuminate some aspect of whiskey that people don't know about? And will it show us how we got to this point right now? That's kind of was really what was on my. And the whole thing about Napo, it was like, wow, there were two things, about Napo. One is like, wow, this is what this at that time was the oldest whiskey existing in Ireland, you know. And number two, what did people used to do when they got really old whiskey? They used to drink it as opposed to flipping it on the internet.
Right. I wonder how many people who won the Macallan 1928s in the, I don't remember the name of the decanter or the artist, the leak
Yeah,
decanters.
the leaks. Yeah,
How many of them have opened it?
yeah,
Really?
yeah. Right.
I'm not saying it's good. It's probably overworked as hell at that point, but still.
Yeah,
Um,
who knew? I mean, my thing about the Macallan there is like, okay, the historical significance of this is that, yeah, they were using Paxaret, it had gone through a whole change up of what was going on with sherry barrels, and then of course their distilling methodology was completely different. They were probably using a lot of um, sulfur candles in order to sterilize the barrels. So yeah, you're gonna taste history, but it may not be the thing that you thought you were getting too.
right.
So
You'll taste the history on the first pour, but you might not want a second one because, ooh,
yeah, okay, I'm good with history. Let's talk
yes,
about today. Right?
exactly. Um, so again, I want to preface this. There are a number of things that we just won't get to for time, and I want to be respectful of your time. But one of the other things, if you will, that is an undercurrent through the book of a topic that shaped whiskey, but it's never called out so much, except in one story it is the reference to how politics, but more so religion, shaped whiskey. And the place where it's called out, for example, is in the division of Baptists and Anabaptists with the Protestant Reformation. We've spoken in with previous guests about divisions between Protestant, Catholic, Protestant Germans, and how these separations have led to which counties went dry or wet during Prohibition, how they voted, how they're still doing that, why certain areas of the country, in the U.S. at least, are hotbeds of distillation and others are dearths of them, deserts of distillation. Um, so again, this is not really called out so much, but I want to give an opportunity for you to just talk about how writ large religion shaped the history of whiskey.
And in a way, I do make almost a distinction between religion and faith,
Fair enough. Yes.
especially
Yeah.
yeah, and there is one. So religion again, faith goes all the way back to antiquity. The human race always looking for something outside themselves to explain what the fuck just happened, to me.
Mhm.
Why did that rock fall on him and not me?
Right.
If you really want to see a great movie, look it up. It came out in the 1970s called Quest for Fire.
Look it up.
Okay. This was, oh my God, this will blow your mind. So this was kind of like walking with, Margaret Mead on this anthropological, tour of the early humanity and all about, fire. Um, so that's always been a thing for me. That's been, since I was a kid, I always asked, how did this begin?
Mhm.
What was the beginning of this? That's always been the number one question on my mind. I can always remember, how did this get here? And so writing a book like this ended up becoming, really kind of like, right in line with kind of how I think.
Sure.
So religion, faith has been around for a long time. And when we're looking for ways to explain things, that's what we go to. And even when we, centuries and eons later, when we discovered science, we still were able to kind of, mash the two of them together, and have one explain the other. Who was who's the famous physicist that, um, Stephen Hawking? At one point, I never forget, is Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, like the largest mind in the universe, right? Um, at one point said in an interview, at one point we just have to trust God, and I thought my brains were gonna like pour out of my ear when I heard it. And he didn't say it in those words, but he said something to the fact that he gave it up. He gave it up to the mystery, right? And so when you think about how the idea of technology came through and how we evolved the quest for fire, learning how to make, a wheel, all of these simple things that were life changing, we would invest them with some sort of importance. And more and more, that investment came from some supernatural thing outside of us. And one of the things, I was always a big student of, Joseph Campbell as well, and Joseph Campbell, was a mythologist who, for example, he was a world mythologist, and saw that there was a garden story in every major civilization in the world. Everyone had a garden story. It's like, yeah, you know. So when you start making advancements in technology that actually has a life-changing effect on you, then you ascribe that to something more than what it is than it is. And that's what followed the whole idea of separating things through heat, which is why the first object in the book is the pot, right? Because that's where, we put things in there and something different came out because we used heat to separate. And then when the Egyptians kind of perfected that, they did this as an ointment. They did this as an offering to whatever gods it was that they were, um, worshiping at the time. The whole idea of the antimony around the blackened antimony around their eyes was a medical religious preparation in order to ward off, um, river blindness and desert blindness. And then, as that whole idea progresses, we, as people who, I think, as a species, we are naturally connected to the idea of the supernatural. Depending on what form we give those gods, depends on the culture that you're in. So we always invest this with something else. And of course, the word spirit comes from that whole idea. When this was when the Muslims, invaded, Southern Europe in the 8th century, they brought with them the, mathematics, right? They brought with them the concept of zero. They brought with them a whole different view of astronomy and astrology. And they brought with them this sacred pot. And in this sacred pot, they took the four elements of the ancient universe, which was earth, wind, fire, and water, and they turned them into a fifth element. And that fifth element, that quintessence, was only able to be understood by the only literate, culture in Southern Europe at that time, which were the monks of the Byzantine Empire and of what became the Holy Roman Empire, because they were the only ones that were literate. They had actually understood writing. Most of the universities of Salamanca and, in Europe and all through the, what is now Spain and Portugal, were all formed in order to actually, how do we interpret these Arabic writings? That's really what how universities started, was to do that, was to interpret all of this knowledge that came out of here. So along with that became this thing, this pot, and then the pot got another pot put on top of it. That was the alambic, that, the in Arabic means pot. So it's a pot on top of another pot. So that's modern day alembic. And what that did was, and when you look at the writings of the alchemists of the Middle Ages, you started to see that this was all about, the dance between mortality and immortality.
Mhm.
About how do we separate? We had come to realize that as organic matter, we putrefy over time, which we call aging. And but how do you fix that? How do we use this new technology to actually address that? And so the concept of medicines comes out of there, and elixirs, and tinctures, and all of these things, that come out of this whole idea of a pot with another pot on top of it, and we're taking one of the four elements of the ancient world and we're turning it into a fifth. And that's where religion gets invested in it. Now, yeah, you had like Jewish mystics in there too, but the Jews, of course, were always scattered. They were always, moved all over the place. So there was never any real concentration of that thought because they were always in diaspora. You know.
Mhm.
But when you actually see in the Holy, and most of it was because of the Holy Roman Empire, you know, um, and so that's where you see like the concentration of this information, that's in these areas where you can go back to and start tracing through that. Um, and uh, so yeah so depending on, you had that, and the Holy Roman Empire was in charge of the Western world for 1,000 years, right? Or so. And then they had a divorce, and that's what we know as Protestantism. And at that time, this is where the monks read. Of course, the monks were always, holy. There were vows. They're under vows. When you look at all of the Tyrannincians and the Carthusians. I mean, these are vows of silence, right? These are men who have a lot of time on their hand, talk about nothing, do nothing but actually, pray to God. And they have all of these secrets inside of their monasteries and inside their abbeys and things like that. And that's where it gets all kept. And then here comes Martin Luther, says, okay, this is all bullshit, and causes the Protestant Reformation. And so all of this stuff starts leaking out, and it goes into the common marketplace of ideas, and different, especially in the Protestant wing of things start breaking up. My metaphor for Protestantism was that there was a big glass mirror on the wall, and then boom, it fell on the ground and shattered into 1,000 pieces. And each one of those pieces is part of the Protestant religion.
Mhm.
The whole idea of, I've got me and a Bible and 10 people. I got a religion. That's pretty much all I need. I can interpret this any way I want to, right? As long as I got people with followers, and I'm going to tax them, so it comes back to that. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's where, so for example, I trace specifically the Anabaptists were one of the sects that came out of the Reformation, and uh, uh, they were not appreciated by the Holy Roman Empire. Was very, very much in place in areas of what we now know as Germany, which was back then the Germanic Empire. It was once part of the Franks, um, and they were kicked out for their unholy beliefs, right? And so they were in diaspora as well, and just like the Presbyterians of the new Scots Irish that were formed in Northern Ireland from that breeding experiment that King James had done a couple hundred years before that. And they brought Protestantism. I mean, they brought a form of Protestantism which was called Presbyterianism, that was based on John Knox, who got that from Calvin. And Calvin was like, no bullshit. There was
Mhm.
no bullshit with Calvin. You're going to die. You're evil. You got to repent. It's all this stuff, and everything that you do is bad. You know,
It kind of amazes
and
you that he got such a big following, doesn't it?
oh, well, think about what was going on: Black Death, disease.
Yeah,
This is actually how you take control of a populace. Is wait till there's a disaster and you're the guy with the
you're the
solution.
savior.
Sound
Right.
familiar?
Yep.
Sound kind of familiar, right? And so yeah, Calvinism is just the Dutch are Calvinists, the Scots are Calvinists through Knox. They bring that down into Northern Ireland. The Scots Irish culture gets formed. They get kicked out from the Anglicans, and that was essentially the beginning of quote unquote the Troubles that lasted all the way through the 1970s in Ireland.
Mhm.
And they come into the United States. They're not appreciated, in where the Pilgrims where any of those people in the northern. And so William Penn says, "Hey, I got a place over here. Come over here. I don't care what it is, you can come over here." And all of a sudden, you have all of these Anabaptists come in there, and now they're called Mennonites. And you have the Scots Irish come in there, and they're Presbyterians, and they end up mixing with the Baptists or the Anabaptists, and they form baptism. And then they go down the Cumberland Gap, and boom, there you go. There's the United States. The history of religion. That should be my next book, The History of Religion and Whiskey.
It's needed. I need one. I'm looking at Smashing the Liquor Machine by Mark Lawrence Schrod, and I had him on a couple of years ago. It's looked through prohibition from the progressivism lens, and how all what is the quote from Dubois or Booker T. Washington, that all progressive things go together or work together.
Okay.
I'm butchering the quote, but the point being, he was looking at it from a particular perspective. But between that and a couple of the other ones that I had read in preparation for that, I was like, I wanted to get more into the history of how the religion and whiskey went together. In that case, for prohibition's sake, but
Yeah.
also just to understand like why are still today certain areas of Tennessee
Yeah.
dry or wet, or and even places in New York are
Yeah.
still, so
Well, there it is. I mean,
yeah.
that's really what it was. It was this confluence of different beliefs in the same God
Mhm.
through the shattered prism of Protestantism.
Right.
The only thing the Protestants had in common with each other is they hated the Catholics.
Yep.
Right? Right? They hated the Catholics, and the Catholics hated the Jews. So then, by connection, the Protestants hated them as well. Because the Catholics did. Right?
Mhm.
The Protestants didn't give shit one way or another. They weren't around at the same time. But it was the Holy Roman Empire that hated them.
Right.
So you have now they're all going to meet at the once in one place.
Yeah.
you know, they're like, okay, that's a prescription for disaster. You know, but
Exactly.
but that's kind of I mean, I trace again. It's me asking the question: how did that start to happen? How did that happen? How did we get to this? All of the current events today. I love finding the little things that kind of track us out. Where did this come from? I grew up, for example, myself. I grew up in the Eastern Orthodox religion, so we're the ancient religion um, of Christianity
Mhm.
that never changed. And the Catholics sort of melded from then, and the Protestants came off of that. So um, uh, I look at it from that historical perspective of kind of like from a religious perspective. That has an effect on culture. Culture has an effect on technology. Technology has an effect on all of the things that we do in real life. Um, Pennsylvania, where I'm from, originally was a mash of all of these cultures. Everybody was in Pennsylvania, in eastern Pennsylvania or western Pennsylvania. Um, you had a mash of all these cultures because that was Penn's charter, William Penn's charter. It's you're free to do, think, and worship whatever the hell it is you want. You know, and and that has a big impact on everything, especially technology. And of course, technology has an impact. But a great book actually, I don't know if you've read this or not. It's Daniel Okrent's Last Call.
No, I haven't read that one.
Absolutely, this is the definitive book on prohibition, and essentially, prohibition is really nothing. It's all about temperance.
Right.
It's the temperance movement, right? And where does that start? Well, it actually starts right there in Europe, and it
Mhm.
starts with, the Calvinists. It starts in England and Ireland, and it starts with the people who said everything that you do is bad, you know, and there you go. And that's kind of where it actually it sort of foments, and it had a massive impact on Irish whiskey. That's where you start seeing the decline of the people who invented whiskey. Whisper, don't tell everybody else. Um, the amount since the 1823 Act, the amount of registered distilleries that were in Ireland were in the thousands. By the time you get to 1900, you're down into the hundreds. So it wasn't essentially the government that closed them down; it was the culture that
Mhm.
closed them down, and the temperance movement. And then you have the 20th century, which is the decimation of Irish whiskey until the late 90s, until the
Sure.
late 80s. Um, so yeah, so it has a massive, massive impact, and that's the stuff that I like knitting together. See, I mean, whiskey by itself becomes just a nerd's paradise. But whiskey in context of the times that it was done in, that to me becomes the broader story. That to me becomes the most interesting story.
Mhm.
Was it a catalyst at this point? Was it a witness at this point? You know, was it some side thing? Was it a serendipitous accident that caused this? Those are the things to me that as a writer, I'm actually most interested in, and I think are actually much more fun, to dig around and look for.
I love it. So I know we are a little bit over time. I want to ask you a final question,
Yeah, sure.
which is on the Barrel Room Chronicles. You said your favorite story in this book was probably that of Golden Wedding Rye,
Oh yeah,
and the most personal story for you was on Talisker when you that was when your recognition moment of when you were going to be in the industry.
right.
Um, so this is a little bit after. It's a couple months later after this episode, or after that episode, excuse me. I'll say, do you hold to those as your favorite and your most personal?
Um, yeah, but I want to qualify. I mean, obviously the Talisker story is the most personal one.
Mhm.
Um, that one and a story that I didn't put in the book, but I tell outside of it, and that was one that Carrie on the Barrel Room Chronicles alluded to,
Mhm.
was actually my origin story with whiskey. Was when I was hired when I used to be an actor in New York City, and I was hired to impersonate a Scottish distiller,
Mhm.
and I had a bad accent that I got from Star Trek,
Right.
and I didn't know what single malt Scotch whiskey was at the time. This is like 1985, and I am going to lead a group of very rich people on Park Avenue through a dinner pairing of single malt Scotch whiskeys. And I had no idea what I was doing the week before that until I was given pamphlets and magazines and to study and to memorize and then just spew it out that entire evening. And I made up this horrible, terrible, just disgusting story about the origin of Macallan. um, but the next day, I bought my first bottle of, I bought in 1999 a bottle of 12-year-old Macallan, and that's how I got hooked. Um, and then there used to be a place down on the South Street Seaport called the North Star Tavern, and they had a display of single malt whiskeys back there. And I used to work at Francis Tavern as a waiter, and I'd bring my tip money up there after my lunch shift, and how do you pronounce that? And let's taste that. And then I find that Talisker and I write that letter to quote unquote Mr. Talisker. We go to the Isle of Skye. I have no understanding of what it is to expect. There was no internet back then, so we were doing this on like a wing and a prayer and some pamphlets. And I was blown away when I got inside of the distillery, and then we went into the the uh, the dunnage warehouse, and we tapped a keg, and I'm going, oh, my mind is blown. So years and years and years later, and this is now a couple decades later, and I'm working for Compass Box, and John Glazer and I are in New York City doing an event, and we decided, okay, let's take a break and let's get a bite to eat. And I told him that story, and I had my phone on me. He says, "Can you bring up YouTube?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Type in this." So I type in this search parameter in YouTube, and it's John Glazer standing with Andy McDonald, the same man, in front of the same cask when he had just started with the brand new Diageo, now being the new director of marketing for Johnny Walker. And they're actually introducing him to all of these whiskeys for the first time. And he says, "That's where I got religion." And he says, "The next time you talk to Dave Broom, ask him where he got religion." And it turned out all three of us were in front of that same cask at three different times. And that to me was mind blowing. You know, that same cask that's been sitting down off the rack all that time, the sample cask, Andy McDonald, who was the production manager there, and Dave Broom, John Glazer, and me. I mean, I'm in heady company right there, with these two guys, But yeah, so that's very, very personal. Yeah, so
Sounds like I
that's
have a cast to go visit.
huh? Yeah,
Sounds like
well,
I've
that's gone now. I'm sure that's tapped now.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I do want to throw out Francis Tavern, one of my wife and I's favorite places to eat and
yeah,
visit in the city. She's a huge
yeah,
American history and American Revolution buff.
yeah.
I'm obviously a big whiskey buff. They got a respectable bar of their own now, and if they're not enough, around the corner you got the Dead Rabbit for
Yeah, Dead Rabbit around the corner. Yeah, you actually
yeah,
have a double feature down there at that point.
yeah.
And also the son of the former owner of Francis Tavern. This is back when I worked there, was owned by a family. Um, the son used to come in during college in the summers, and they'd put him to work in the kitchen. And he eventually opened up the old 76 house, which is up here in northern New Jersey, in Tappan, New Jersey, or Tappan, New Jersey. And the old 76 house was a Washington's headquarters where Major John Andre was garrisoned before he was hung right around the corner. And John Andre was one of the conspirators with
Benedict
who was the
Arnold.
guy that with Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was caught. He was put on trial there. He was garrisoned there. And then there's actually a plaque for Andre Hill at the top of the hill. There was a tree. They hung up on that tree. Anyway, after they sold Francis Tavern to the current owners, actually these are the people who own the Dingle distillery in Ireland. Then his son bought that place up there, and he's kind of continued the whole washing. And it's like the original. It's the original blockhouse that you can have dinner in, and they got a great whiskey selection up there too. So shout out to the old 76 house in Tappan, New York, or Tappan, New Jersey.
I'll have to take a trip over the river for there.
Yeah, it's actually it's a beautiful area, and it's worth the trip up there.
Awesome. Well, Robin, thank you again so much for writing this book, for coming on to talk about it. I've had a blast talking to you. Always do, but now we've got a recorded version of it.
There you go.
Um, and yeah, just thank you. I really look forward to this episode going live. People feel free to please do see if you see Robin at an event, if you see that he's going to be a book signing or a whiskey tasting. I know the series at Astor has now just ended, but hey, there's going to be more, I'm sure.
There'll be other places. Yeah,
There'll be
yeah,
other
yeah.
places.
It's just yeah.
He's just a fantastic person to listen to watch, talk about it, and one of those people that when you watch him talk about the stuff, he's passionate about it. And there's no better compliment I can give than that.
I
So
greatly appreciate that, David. Very nice of you. Thank you.
Robin, hang out with me for just 30 seconds after we finish recording to close out.
Okay.
There will be links in the show notes to, of course, where you can purchase the book, where you can look at reviews, where you can listen to other interviews about this that may have touched on things that I didn't. And thank you, Robin, for listening. I'll see you all next week.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, David.